Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Tim and I'm a composer. Today we're going to talk about an extraordinary piece of choral music, one that you'll probably recognise when you hear it, even if its name is unfamiliar, because it's been used in everything from films to adverts to even computer games. It comes from around 1570 from Tudor England. It's Thomas Tallis's 40-part motet, Spem in alium. That's its name, Spem in alium. 40 independent vocal parts, not 40 voices singing the same thing together or in groups singing the same part together, but 40 different melodic lines, all happening at once, all obeying the strict rules of Renaissance counterpoint. That is to say, despite there being 40 independent parts, it sounds together. It sounds beautiful. It doesn't sound like a mess or a cacophony. Now, if you've heard it, you probably remember the experience. If you haven't, well, we'll get to some listening recommendations towards the end of the podcast. But you should go and listen to it. You won't regret it. Now, I want to spend this episode really digging into the piece and find out who Tallis was, why he wrote it, how he achieved this technical feat, and in fact, why this is a technical feat at all, what the words mean, and why a piece of 16th century sacred music ended up becoming famous in the 21st century, partly because of an erotic novel. Quite a journey we're going to go on. So, let's start with some context, because you really can't understand this piece without understanding what England was like in the 1500s. Thomas Tallis was born around about 1505, give or take a few years. We don't know exactly when, because no birth records survive for him. We do know, however, that he died in 1585. Now, that 80-year lifespan took him through what I think was probably the most turbulent period in English religious history. Now, I want to spend a bit of time on this because it's really important for understanding both the man, Thomas Tallis, and the music. In particular, Spem in alium, his 40-part motet. When Tallis was born, England was Catholic. It had been that way for 1,000 years. Well, there had been Christians in the British Isles since Roman times, in fact, but the mission of Pope Gregory in the 7th century is really when we can say that Roman Catholicism was established in England. So by the time of Tallis, that's been there for about 1,000 years. Every village had its church. The calendar was structured around saints' days and feast days. Monasteries dotted the landscape and provided education, healthcare, relief to the poor, and general hospitality to travellers. The Pope in Rome was the head of the church, and superior in that sense to the King of England, and that was just how things were. Until Henry VIII came along. Now, Henry VIII didn't start out as a reformer, like Martin Luther on the continent perhaps. Quite the opposite. In fact, he wrote a book attacking Martin Luther's theology, and the Pope gave Henry VIII the title Defender of the Faith in return. British monarchs still use that title, Defender of the Faith, today, which is a nice irony given what happened next. Henry wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon, his wife, because she hadn't given him a male heir, and the Pope wouldn't grant an annulment. So Henry simply declared himself supreme head of the church in England, and this was formally recognised by the English Parliament in 1534. Problem solved from his perspective, and he allowed himself to divorce Catherine. Now, this wasn't really Protestantism in the theological sense. Henry still believed in Catholic tenets such as transubstantiation. He still held elaborate Latin masses. He still burned Protestant heretics at the stake. In fact, in 1540, he executed both Catholics for denying his supremacy over the church and Protestants for denying Catholic doctrine on the same day. And that gives you a sense of how confusing and dangerous this period was. But the really devastating thing Henry did was to dissolve the monasteries. Between 1536 and 1540, nearly 900 religious houses were closed. Monasteries, priories, convents, friaries. About 12,000 monks, nuns and friars were dispersed. 1 in 50 adult men in England was in religious orders at that time, and suddenly they weren't. The buildings were stripped of their valuables, lead roofing, bells, gold and silver plate, and then they were either demolished or just left to decay. The land was sold off to nobles and the gentry, which created a vested interest in making sure the dissolution was permanent. If you've ever visited in England places such as Fountains Abbey or Glastonbury or Tintern, these romantic ruins, that's what happens to them. They weren't always ruins. They were working institutions that had been there for centuries, and then in the space of about 4 years, they were gone. For example, their stone taken to build new buildings. What was left fell to ruins or disappeared entirely. Shakespeare, writing in the 1590s, could evoke in Sonnet 73, "bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang." And people would know exactly what he meant. They'd seen this happen within living memory. And this is directly relevant to Tallis because he was working at Waltham Abbey when it was dissolved in March 1540. Waltham Abbey was actually the last monastery to close in England. Tallis was there at the very end of the monastic era. He was paid off with 40 shillings, which was actually not a bad sum. It was about 1 year's earnings for a skilled worker. And then he had to go and find new employment. While we don't really know anything of Tallis's early life, we know that by 1531 he was employed as an organist at Dover Priory, probably in his mid to late 20s. He, or at least someone with the name Thomas Tallis, spelled T-A-L-E-S, so slightly differently to the usual spelling of Tallis, T-A-L-L-I-S, and he was listed in the records as Joculator Organum, a great title, I think. And he was also responsible for training 6 singing boys in return for an annual payment of £2. Dover Priory, that is, was dissolved in 1535 by Henry VIII, and Tallis turned up a few months later working at St Mary at Hill in Billingsgate in London as either an organist or a singer, or maybe both. And he stayed there until 1538, and that's when he went to Waltham Abbey until it too was dissolved. In addition to the 40 shillings, Tallis took with him from Waltham Abbey several technical books on music, books about the rules of counterpoint and polyphony. I'll just explain that word in case it's unfamiliar. Polyphony means many sounds, but in vocal music specifically, it means several parts moving independently rather than in block chords. Choral music had evolved by this point from single line plain chants to multiple lines of music weaving together. Now this weaving together is called counterpoint, and the overall texture of that kind of music is called polyphony. As it is quite tricky, to weave together vocal parts like this, scholarly treatises were written, such as those that Tallis took with him from Waltham Abbey. Now, these books then explain the rules of counterpoint that enable you to compose effectively in this way. To build upon the work of previous composers, a hugely important point in the appreciation of literate music. Treatises such as this were vital to that process. And this music, ornate and elaborate polyphony, was the distinctive sound of the Catholic Church by this point. So that's in the time of Henry VIII. Henry died in 1547, and then his son Edward VI took over. Edward was only 9 years old, but his regents were committed Protestants, and suddenly England lurched in a Protestant direction. Latin was replaced by English in church services. The Book of Common Prayer was introduced. Elaborate church music was discouraged. The authorities wanted simple, clear settings where you could understand every word, every English word that is, not the elaborate polyphonic stuff that Tallis had been trained to write. Tallis by now was at Canterbury Cathedral, where the records show he led a choir of 10 boys and 12 men. Yes, they were all male. There were no female voices singing in these choirs. Indeed, this tradition of male-only choirs, boys and men, continues just about to the present day, giving English cathedral choirs their distinctive sound. But increasingly, as our culture changes, there are now girls and women in some cathedral choirs, and while that is social progress, perhaps we will lose the distinctive sound of male-only choirs that evolved over centuries. So anyway, back to the 16th century and our story. Edward VI died in 1553, aged only 15, and his half-sister Mary took over. Mary was Catherine of Aragon's daughter, the one Henry had divorced. She was devoutly Catholic, and she set about reversing everything. Latin came back, the old liturgy came back, and Protestants were persecuted. Nearly 300 people were burned at the stake during Mary's 5-year reign, which is why she became known as Bloody Mary. Then Mary died in 1558, and her half-sister Elizabeth took over. Elizabeth was Anne Boleyn's daughter. Now, Anne, she was the one that Henry married, the second marriage that he divorced Catherine for, and that had caused all this trouble in the first place. Elizabeth restored Protestantism, but tried to find a middle way, elaborate enough ceremonially to satisfy traditionalists, Protestant enough doctrinally to satisfy reformers. She kept Catholic imagery like crucifixes in her private chapel, which apparently annoyed the Puritans no end. So in the space of about 25 years, England went Catholic to sort of Protestant to full-on Protestant to Catholic again to Protestant again. And Tallis served as musician through all of it. That's 4 monarchs and 4 completely different sets of requirements for what church music should sound like. He wrote florid Latin polyphony for Henry and Mary, spare English anthems for Edward, and both for Elizabeth. His epitaph proudly notes that he served four sovereigns reines. That's in sort of Old English writing, four sovereigns reines, a thing not often seen. The reigns of 4 sovereigns, a thing not often seen. Now, I need to explain something else before we get back to Tallis properly, because it's essential for understanding what Spem and alium meant when it was written as a piece of music. What happened to Catholics under Elizabeth? The word recusant comes from the Latin recusare, meaning to refuse. A recusant was someone who refused to attend Church of England services as required by law. Initially, the fine for non-attendance was 12 pence or 1 shilling per Sunday. Not nothing, but manageable for wealthy families, probably equivalent to about $500 to $1,000 or pounds in today's money. Elizabeth famously said she didn't want to make windows into men's souls. If you turned up to church on Sunday, nobody was going to interrogate you about what you actually believed. Just turn up, though, and avoid the fine and the associated trouble. But then things changed. In 1568, Mary, Queen of Scots, Catholic claimant to the English throne, fled to England and became Elizabeth's prisoner. In 1569, Catholic nobles in the north rose up in rebellion, tried to free Mary and restore Catholicism. In 1570, the Pope issued a bull or decree excommunicating Elizabeth and declaring her deposed as queen, releasing Catholics from their allegiance to her and calling on them to disobey her laws. In 1571, the next year, the Ridolfi plot aimed to overthrow Elizabeth with Spanish military support and put Mary on the throne. After all that, being Catholic wasn't just a matter of private conscience then. To Elizabeth and her government and supporters, being Catholic looked like treason, and the persecution escalated accordingly. By 1581, the recusancy fine had increased to £20 per month, which is a ruinous sum. It's equivalent to many thousands of pounds today. Bear in mind that an average skilled worker's annual wage was about 40 shillings and £1 was 20 shillings. So this is a fine equal to several years' middle-class wages. Simply saying or hearing Mass became punishable by fine and imprisonment. Jesuit missionaries who came from the continent to minister secretly to English Catholics were hunted down. If caught, they were tried for treason. And the punishment for treason for a man was being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Now, I'm going to describe this because I think people sometimes hear that phrase, hanged, drawn, and quartered, without really understanding what it means. But it's not pleasant, so, skip ahead 15 or 30 seconds if you prefer. So, this is what happened. The condemned person was tied to a wooden panel and dragged by horse through the streets to the place of execution. Then they were hanged on the gallows until nearly dead, but ideally still conscious. Then they were cut down, still alive. Then they were drawn, that is, disemboweled with their intestines removed and burned before their eyes. Then they were castrated. Then finally they were beheaded, and only here is the moment of death if the job had been done properly. Then the body was quartered, that is, cut into 4 pieces, which were displayed publicly as a warning to others. So as I said, this was the punishment for treason, for a man. Women were instead burned at the stake, as the gruesome process of hanging, drawing, and quartering was considered too indecent when done to a woman. Edmund Campion, a Jesuit priest, was executed this way in December 1581. When asked to confess his treason at the scaffold, he replied, "If to say Mass be treason, I confess to have done it and glory in it." He was 41 years old. Nearly 200 Catholics were executed like this during Elizabeth's reign. Many Catholics survived by what was called occasional conformity, attending Anglican services outwardly while remaining Catholic privately. These church papists, as they were known, were despised by strict recusants and by the Jesuit missionaries, but the practice allowed families to survive. Often the male head of household would conform publicly, while wives and daughters maintained Catholic practice in private. Tallis appears to have been one of these quiet conformists. His epitaph and his will contain no explicit Catholic references, unlike his pupil, the famous composer William Byrd, who was much more confrontational about his faith. Byrd was repeatedly fined for recusancy. Tallis, by contrast, seems to have navigated the whole period by keeping his head down and getting on with his work. His epitaph describes him as living in mild and quiet sort. But here's the thing. Remember the piece of music this podcast is about, Spem in alium. It sets a Latin text from the old Catholic Sarum rite, a text that had been banned under Elizabeth. And this for a work apparently performed for Catholic patrons, including possibly the Duke of Norfolk, who would later be executed for a Catholic conspiracy against Elizabeth. The piece exists in this incredibly charged political context where writing the wrong thing could literally get you killed in a pretty gruesome way. Back to the story of Spem in alium and its composer Thomas Tallis then. Who was Thomas Tallis? Well, the honest answer is we don't really know that much. No contemporary portrait survives. The image you see if you do a Google image search for him was painted 150 years after his death and probably therefore bears no resemblance at all to the actual man. We don't know his parents' names or where exactly he was born, though Kent seems likely based on family name connections. His only known relative was a cousin called John Sayer. What we do know is his career trajectory, pieced together from institutional records. He first appears as organist at Dover Priory, then St Mary at Hill Church in London, then Waltham Abbey from 1538 until its dissolution in 1540, then Canterbury Cathedral, and then around 1543 he joined the Chapel Royal, where he would remain for over 40 years until his death. The Chapel Royal, it wasn't a building, it was a body of clergy and musicians who accompanied the monarch wherever they went. When the court moved from Greenwich to Hampton Court to Whitehall, the Chapel Royal moved too. Tallis sang, he played the organ, he composed new music, and probably helped train the boy choristers. He had lifetime tenure, which was valuable, though the basic salary was quite modest. Royal musicians made their real money through additional grants and pensions. Around 1552, Tallis married a woman named Joan, who was the widow of another Chapel Royal employee called Thomas Berry. We know basically nothing about their sort of romantic relationship. They had no children. Don't know whether that's by choice or circumstance, we can't say. The marriage lasted about 33 years until Tallis's death, though. His epitaph commemorates that they lived in love full 33 years. Late in life, Tallis lived in Greenwich, close to the Palace of Placentia, where the court was often based. Local tradition says he rented a house on Stockwell Street. Joan survived him by nearly 4 years and was cared for after his death by another gentleman of the Chapel Royal, suggesting a close-knit community of royal musicians who looked after their own. Tallis died peacefully at home in November 1585, aged about 80, a remarkable lifespan for the time. In his will, he left money towards their feast for his Chapel Royal colleagues. This was an annual event where the monarch's private singers made merry together. The bequest suggests real affection for the people he had worked with for decades. His pupil William Byrd wrote a musical elegy on Tallis's death. Tallis is dead and music dies. And actually, let's talk about William Byrd for a moment, because the relationship between these two, Tallis and Byrd, is important. Byrd was born around 1539, which makes him about 35 years younger than Tallis. Tallis was old enough to be his father, in other words. According to contemporary sources, Byrd was bred up to music under Thomas Tallis, meaning Tallis taught him probably from his teenage years when Byrd was a boy chorister at the Chapel Royal. When Byrd was appointed organist at Lincoln Cathedral in 1563, he was about 23 and Tallis was about 58. Byrd stayed at Lincoln Cathedral until 1572, when he became joint organist of the Chapel Royal alongside Tallis, who was by then around 67. The description, much as Haydn was to Mozart, captures this kind of dynamic. An older master and a younger genius, colleagues and friends despite the generational gap. In 1575, Queen Elizabeth granted them jointly a monopoly on printing music and ruled music paper, one of the first arrangements of its kind in England. They used it to publish the Cantiones Sacrae, a collection of Latin motets with 17 pieces by each composer, 34 in total, one for each year of Elizabeth's reign. It was meant to be a grand prestige project. Unfortunately, it was a financial disaster. In 1577, they had to petition the Queen for help, pleading that the publication had fallen out to our great loss and that Tallis was now very aged. The contrasting temperaments are interesting. Tallis navigated religious upheaval by quiet compliance. Byrd, on the other hand, was much more confrontational. While Tallis made no explicit reference to Catholicism in his will, Byrd's will explicitly identified him as a Catholic. Byrd was repeatedly fined for recusancy and wrote music for clandestine Catholic masses held in the homes of Catholic gentry. Yet both men served Protestant monarchs faithfully while privately adhering to the old faith. It's a reminder that there were different ways of being a Catholic composer in Elizabethan England, and Tallis chose the quieter path. Now let's get to Spem in alium itself. The question of when and why Tallis wrote it has been debated for years, and there's still no definitive answer. But the dominant theory involves an Italian composer named Alessandro Strigio. In 1567, in June, Strigio visited London as part of a diplomatic mission. He was a distinguished composer in his own right, and he brought with him some extraordinary music. A 40-voice motet called Ecce Beatum Lucem, and a mass for 40 or possibly even 60 voices. These were showpieces designed to impress, and they certainly did. Now, we have an account written in 1611 by a man named Thomas Wateridge. I should say up front, this account has some problems. It was written 40 years after the alleged events, and some details don't quite fit, but it's the closest thing we have to a primary source about the piece's origins. Wateridge tells the story of an Italian who came to England and sang a song of 30 parts, which is odd because Strigio's pieces were 40 and 60 parts, not 30. But anyway, this Italian performance supposedly prompted a challenge. Could English composers match it? According to Wateridge, the challenge was issued to the musicians at a place he leaves blank, and Tallis rose to it. The resulting piece was performed at Arundel House for a nobleman whose name Wateridge also leaves blank, but who was almost certainly Thomas Howard, 4th Duke of Norfolk. The Duke was so pleased that he apparently gave Tallis a gold chain from around his own neck. If this story is true, Spem in alium was composed sometime between Strigio's visit in 1567 and October 1569, when Norfolk was imprisoned for his involvement in Catholic conspiracies. Norfolk was beheaded in 1572, so the piece was written for England's foremost Catholic nobleman during an incredibly dangerous period, setting a banned Catholic text. There are alternative theories. A scholar called Paul Doe suggested 1573 for Elizabeth's 40th birthday, 40-part motet, 40th birthday. A scholar called George Steele argues for 1556 during Mary I's reign for her 40th birthday, noting parallels between Mary and the biblical Judith. Another scholar, Hugh Cate, has proposed that it was actually Strigio's 60-voice mass, not his 40-voice motet, that provoked Tallis's response. The honest answer is we don't really know the origin story for certain, but the Strigio connection remains the most widely accepted theory. Let me say a bit more about the Duke of Norfolk, because he's a fascinating and tragic figure. Thomas Howard, 4th Duke of Norfolk, was the richest and most powerful nobleman in England, Elizabeth's second cousin, and the head of England's leading Catholic dynasty. Despite being educated partly by Protestant tutors, including John Fox, who was a famous martyrologist who wrote about Protestant martyrs under Mary, despite that, Norfolk remained privately Catholic. In 1565, William Cecil described Norfolk as wise, just, modest, careful, and a father and stay to this country. But Norfolk's downfall came through his obsession with Mary, Queen of Scots. After Mary fled to England in 1568, Norfolk became convinced he could solve England's succession crisis by marrying her. The scheme wasn't inherently treasonous, but Norfolk lacked the courage either to seek Elizabeth's permission openly or to act decisively in secret. When Catholic nobles rose in rebellion in 1569, Norfolk was implicated. Elizabeth imprisoned him, but released him in 1570 for lack of evidence. Almost immediately he got drawn into the Ridolfi plot, which was a conspiracy to overthrow Elizabeth with Spanish military support and put Mary on the throne. Norfolk placed himself at the head of the conspirators and asked Philip II of Spain to approve his marriage to Mary. The plot was exposed in 1571. Norfolk was arrested, tried for high treason, and beheaded on Tower Hill in June 1572. He was only about 34-35 years old. Elizabeth reportedly was somewhat sad at his death. So, if Wateridge's account is accurate, Tallis's greatest work was commissioned by a man who would be executed for treason just a few years later. The piece's use of a banned Catholic text, combined with its biblical Judith narrative, and that's a story about an enemy general being beheaded, takes on a rather pointed political overtone in that context. Speaking of which, let's talk about the text. Spem in alium nunquam habui preta in te Deus Israel, which means, I have never put my hope in any other but in thee, God of Israel. The full text is a responsory from the Saurum Rite. That's the distinctive English form of the Catholic liturgy that was suppressed under Elizabeth. It comes from the readings for the 5th week of September, when the Old Testament book of Judith was read at Matins. So here's a rough translation. I have never put my hope in any other but in thee, God of Israel, who will be angry yet become again gracious, and who forgives all the sins of man in tribulation. Lord God, creator of heaven and earth, look upon our humility. The book of Judith is what's called deuterocanonical. It's part of the Catholic Bible, but not the Protestant one. The story concerns a widow named Judith who saves the besieged city of Bethulia by seducing and then beheading the Assyrian general Holofernes. The siege lasted 40 days, which resonates with the 40 voices of Tallis's piece. The text would have carried enormous emotional weight for English Catholics in the 1560s and 70s. I have never put my hope in any other but in thee, sung by people whose faith had been outlawed, whose priests were being hunted, whose churches had been stripped and their monasteries demolished. Lord God, creator of heaven and earth, look up on our humility, a plea from people who could be fined, imprisoned, or killed gruesomely for their beliefs. There may be allegorical meanings too. Some scholars have suggested that Judith represents Elizabeth, triumphant over her Catholic enemies. Others have suggested Judith represents Mary, Queen of Scots, or even the hoped-for Catholic restoration. The scholar John Milsom has proposed that Catholic nobles may have introduced a coded reference to the Ridolfi plot, Judith beheading Holofernes as allegory for action against Elizabeth. We can't know for certain what Tallis or his patrons intended, but the text does not seem a politically neutral choice. Okay, so how do you actually write a piece for 40 independent voices? This is where it gets very interesting from a composer's perspective. The 40 voices are arranged as 8 5-voice choirs. Each choir has the standard Renaissance voicing: soprano, alto, tenor, baritone, and bass. But they're not just 8 identical ensembles. Tallis uses them in constantly shifting combinations. The piece opens with a single soprano voice, alone. Then other voices enter one by one, each imitating and slightly changing each time, each new voice picking up the melodic idea and developing it. As each choir joins, the previous voices gradually fall silent. So you get this extraordinary effect of sound sweeping around the space from choir 1 to choir 8. If the choirs are arranged, therefore, in a circle or a horseshoe around the audience, which is probably how the piece was intended to be performed, it's like a sort of lighthouse, a beam of light rotating around. So here's the simple opening theme, played on the piano rather than sung. I won't inflict that on you. When you listen to the complete piece, listen out for this little fragment as it comes back again and again, and listen to how it's developed. Here it is. Now, I like hearing this thing at the start of a composition. It's as if the composer is saying, Here are my raw ingredients. That's all it is. And from this, I will take you on a journey, tell you a story, create a sumptuous 10-course meal. Pick your own metaphor. And here it is, the opening again, but with the second line appearing, so you can get an idea of how these voices are developing and working together. Here we go. And so more voices are added, more and more. You get the rotating effect. And the opening cascade continues for about 39 bars. And then at bar 40 voices, bar 40, you see what he did there? All 40 voices enter simultaneously for the first time. It's an overwhelming wall of sound. If you're standing in the middle of a proper surround sound performance, it's a hugely dramatic moment. Now after that first tutti meaning all voices together, the imitative pattern reverses direction, sweeping back from choir 8 to choir 1. There's a second full tutti moment at bar 69, which is roughly the midpoint of the piece. So these moments, when everyone is singing together, these tuttis, these walls of sound, they happen at bar 40 and bar 69. 40, well, that's clearly significant as there are 40 parts. Maybe it has another significance too. And what about 69? Turns out bar 69 contains a mystery. The scholar Hugh Cate, his research has pointed to some possible numerological games going on here. This kind of number symbolism was a big part of Renaissance learned culture, even a sort of intellectual pastime, a bit like sort of a serious Sudoku or cryptic crossword today. It drew on several traditions. Medieval Christian numerology, where numbers carried theological weight, 3 for the Trinity, 7 for perfection, 40 for periods of trial and tribulation, as in the 40 days of Lent, Christ's 40 days in the wilderness. It also drew on the Pythagorean tradition, revived by Renaissance humanism, which saw mathematical relationships as expressions of cosmic harmony. And there was influence too from the Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition that assigned numerical values to Hebrew letters and found hidden meanings in the resulting calculations. Christian scholars in the Renaissance adapted these Kabbalistic techniques to Latin and Greek texts. So, let's get Kabbalistic with things then. If you assign numbers to letters in the Latin alphabet, A equals 1, B equals 2, so on, then Tallis, Tallis, adds up to 69, and Judith, Judith, also adds up to 69. One way of measuring the length of the whole piece, Spem and alium, is to count the number of breathes, which are double whole notes. One of these double whole notes was also called a long, and the piece is 69 longs in duration. So a long is the original note value, roughly equivalent to our modern whole note, which is half as long as a long. Sorry if this is confusing, but this also means that in standard modern notation, where one bar is one whole note in duration, that places bar 69 at the halfway point. Perhaps if you imagine music progressing along a horizontal, like a line, and then you draw a vertical line at the halfway point, all the music happening at once, then you would get a cross. Is that a coincidence? You tell me. And what's more, Maria, Maria, adds up to 40. Why Maria? Well, Mary, Queen of Scots, as a Judith figure, if you like. And 40 voices, 40 also being the symbol of trial and tribulation, as you might suppose the Catholics felt was their condition at this time. Now, I should add a word of caution here before we get carried away. First, spelling wasn't standardised in Tudor England. That didn't really happen until Johnson's dictionary in 1755. People spelled the same word in different ways, within a single document sometimes, and their own names differently at different times. The one surviving example of Tallis's signature actually spells it Tallys, with a Y instead of an I, and that would give a different number, 85, I think, and nothing special happens at bar 85. So the Tallis equals 69 calculation depends on a spelling that Tallis himself didn't use, at least not the one time he wrote his name down on something that survives to the present day. Secondly, and more fundamentally, these patterns tend to be found when people go looking for them. It's a bit like seeing a face in the shape of the craters on the moon. If you search hard enough for numerical coincidences and patterns in any complex work, you'll probably find some. That doesn't mean they were put there deliberately. Perhaps there is, after all, something special about bar 85, now we've picked it as a possibly important number? Well, no, there isn't. That said, the coincidences here are, at a minimum, quite suggestive. Judith, Judith, equals 69. Bar 69 is the halfway point. 40 voices, 40 days of siege in the Judith story. Maria equals 40. Now, whether Tallis consciously embedded all this, or whether we're finding patterns where we look for them, we really can't say, and in fact, we'll never know for certain. But these kinds of games were certainly part of how Renaissance composers thought about structure, and they certainly played these games a lot. The second half of the piece, after bar 69, uses more antiphonal effects. Antiphonal meaning choirs answering each other, bouncing back and forth, a bit like a tennis match. Opposing pairs, groups of four. There's a striking shift to a more block-like texture on the words Domine Deus, Creator Caeli et Terrae, Lord God, Creator of heaven and earth. Where before the voices were weaving independent lines, now they move together in massive chords. It's like the difference between, a complex woven tapestry and a solid wall of painted colour. Nearer to the end, there's a general pause, silence, and then a striking chord on the word respice, look upon. The harmony shifts unexpectedly, grabbing your attention for this crucial word, look upon our humility. And then the final build-up to the close on respice humilitatem nostram, a plea for humility delivered in the most magnificent, overwhelming texture of all the vocal lines weaving in and out. There's something almost paradoxical about that, isn't there? The most humble words set to the most extravagant music. I want to spend a moment on just how difficult this is to do as a composer. When you write counterpoint, multiple independent melodic lines happening simultaneously, you have to make sure every pair of voices relates to each other correctly. You can't have what are called parallel fifths or octaves between only two voices, for example. You have to control dissonance carefully. Every vertical sonority has to make harmonic sense. These are the rules of counterpoint, and they're not arbitrary. They really work. There are all kinds of reasons why they work, and it's absolutely fascinating to go into that, but that's probably a rabbit hole for another episode. But with four voices alone, you have 6 possible pairings to keep track of. 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4, 1 and 3, 1 and 4, and 2 and 4, to make sure the intervals are working well between all of those pairs. Now with 40 voices, you have, I worked this out honestly, 780 possible pairings. Every single one of those relationships, every moment in the piece has to work. Every moment of the piece, any 2 voices you pick out have to be in correct contrapuntal relation to each other, both at that moment and from one moment to the next moment. Now, a scholar called Kevin Davis did a computational analysis, and that confirmed that Tallis achieved what he called ironclad adherence to Renaissance rules across all 40 parts. Complete avoidance of forbidden intervals. Another scholar, Peter Schubert, has suggested Tallis may have used a systematic method that ensured every chord contained all 3 interval classes above the bass, root, third and fifth, which would mathematically prevent parallel motion using this system. And we don't know if that's actually what Tallis did, but I think he must have used, some kind of system like that. He certainly didn't have a computer to help him. But that's just maths, in a way. It's a sort of grand Sudoku, which is impressive, but not really transcendent. So here's what I think is the real magic. Each individual vocal line is simple and entirely singable. There's nothing virtuosic about any single part. The complexity is emergent. It arises from the combination of simple elements, not from the difficulty of the elements themselves. And from that complex weave emerges a magnificent piece of music that moves your soul, takes you on a journey, and causes people like me to make podcasts about it more than 400 years later. Creating all this from 40 individually simple melodies requires a completely different kind of compositional thinking, and that's a real artist, a real composer at work. You might well ask, was this unprecedented? Were there other pieces of music for this many voices? Apart from Striggio's pieces, as we mentioned earlier. There were a few. Johannes Ockeghem wrote a 36-voice Deo Gratias in the 15th century, but that's more of a canonic exercise. A few voices generating all the others through strict imitation, like singing London's Burning as a round. It's impressive as a technical feat, but it doesn't have the same variety of texture that Tallis achieves. It doesn't have that kind of emergent complexity that becomes something much greater than the sum of its ingredients. And then yes, there's Striggio himself, whose 40 and 60 voice pieces may have prompted Tallis's response. But in Striggio's large-scale works, the voices mostly move together in block chords rather than weaving independent lines. It's certainly spectacular, but it's a different kind of spectacle. What sets Tallis apart is the combination of scale and the independence of the vocal lines. The opening section, where voices enter one by one in imitation across all 40 parts, that has no comparison from the era, and you could probably easily say it has no comparison since that era either. I mentioned that the 8 choirs were probably arranged in a circle around the audience. This spatial dimension is really important. It's believed that the piece was designed for Nonsuch Palace and first performed there. A Nonsuch Palace, it had an octagonal banqueting hall with 4 first-floor balconies, perfect for placing 4 choirs on the ground floor and 4 in the galleries above. So when the music sweeps from choir 1 through to choir 8 and back again, you're not just hearing a progression of music, you're hearing sound move through physical space. When all 40 voices sing together, you're enveloped, sound coming at you from every direction all at once. This is, you could say, perhaps the first 360-degree immersive surround sound experience in music history. It predates the Venetian polychoral experiments that are usually credited with pioneering spatial music. In those works, choirs or groups of instruments were placed around cathedrals, and they would sort of sing to each other across that vast space. But Tallis did it first. Tallis reckoned that if you have this many voices, you might as well distribute them around the space and make the spatial movement part of the compositional design. Perhaps Tallis saw Nonsuch Palace and took full advantage of the space, inspired him. Now, unfortunately, you can't go and see Nonsuch Palace for yourself. It was called Nonsuch because it was so splendid. Nonsuch, no other place could compare to it. It was intended to showcase Henry VIII's power and wealth following the dissolution of the monasteries. I wonder how Tallis felt about that, being asked to compose a piece for performance in a place that represented such destruction of everything that had been important to his early life. Does that give new significance to the line respice humilitatem, look upon our humility, which is the most magnificent and unhumble moment in the piece? This is the kind of thing, sort of subversive, sarcastic in a way. This is the kind of thing a secretly Catholic recusant composer might do. Centuries later, you see the same kind of thing done by Shostakovich in his time working under Stalin. That's certainly a topic for another podcast. But yes, unfortunately, you can't go and see Nonsuch Palace yourself. The palace was gifted by Charles II to someone called Lady Castlemaine, who had it demolished in around 1683 to sell the materials. A double irony when you consider the fate of the monasteries was often to provide building materials. What of the music, the written music itself? No manuscript from Tallis's lifetime survives. The earliest surviving source is in the British Library, and that dates from the early 17th century, about 25 years after Tallis's death. This manuscript was prepared for the investiture of Henry Frederick as Prince of Wales in 1610, and presumably copied from a version dating from closer to the original, but the original does not survive. Interestingly, for that performance, this investiture of Henry Frederick, the piece was sung with an English text. "Sing and glorify heaven's high majesty," it says. Now this is called a contrafactum, the same music, different words. The original Latin text at that time was banned. The piece was performed again at Charles I's coronation in 1625, and then it basically disappears from documented performances for over 300 years. The work was rediscovered in 1947. Bertram Schofield's 1951 study in Musical Quarterly was the first major scholarly analysis. The first recording was made in 1948, with the composer Michael Tippett conducting the Morley College Choir for EMI. Can you imagine being in that room, to be there among some of the first people in centuries to hear those 40 voices combine? David Wilcox in 1965 recorded with the combined choirs of King's College, Cambridge, using 80 people, and that brought the piece to significantly wider attention. But it was really the Tallis scholars' 1985 recording that became the benchmark. Peter Phillips recorded in Merton College Chapel, Oxford, with one singer per part, 40 voices, each line distinct, and that won the Gramophone Record of the Year award. And then, in 2011, something very strange happened. E.L. James published 50 Shades of Grey. And there's a scene where the protagonist, Christian Grey, listens to Spem and Alium during, shall we say, an intimate encounter. The narrator describes hearing, "From inside my head, a lone angelic voice sings, joined almost immediately by another voice. Holy cow, a celestial choir!" The Tallis Scholars recording jumped to number 7 on the UK Classical Singles chart, number 4 on the iTunes Classical chart. Peter Phillips, that is the conductor of the Tallis Scholars on that recording, was asked about this, and he said, "I haven't read 50 Shades of Grey, but I am most grateful to the author for introducing so many new listeners to the musical sensation that is Thomas Tallis's Spem in Alium." I think there's something wonderfully absurd about a piece of banned Catholic liturgical music written for a patron who would be executed for treason becoming famous through an erotic novel. Just a shame it wasn't called 40 Shades of Grey, I suppose. I'll get my coat. No, I won't. There's a podcast to finish. Now, the other major contribution to the piece's modern fame is a sound installation by Janet Cardiff called simply the 40-part motet, which she created in 2001. That uses 40 high-fidelity speakers arranged in a large oval, each playing a single voice recorded individually from the Salisbury Cathedral Choir. Now, this installation, it runs on a 14-minute loop, which includes about 3 minutes of the singers chatting and warming up between takes. You can walk among the speakers, stand next to individual voices. You can experience the music from inside the texture. When the full ensemble comes together, standing in the centre is super dramatic and overwhelming. It won the Millennium Prize at its Ottawa premiere and is now permanently housed at the National Gallery of Canada. So go and see and hear that if you're nearby. I think this installation by Janet Cardiff captures something essential about the piece that's hard to get from a conventional concert performance. And that's the spatial element, the sense of being completely surrounded, being enveloped, the ability to focus on individual lines or let the whole thing wash over you. Definitely worth seeking out if you ever get the chance. But assuming you can't get to Canada, let's talk about some other ways to listen to this piece. For a first listen then, I would suggest the Tallis Scholars recording from 1985, conducted by Peter Phillips. It's on all the usual streaming services, and you can see it and hear it in the film of 50 Shades of Grey if you like. One voice per part, beautifully clear. It lets you hear the structure. This is the recording that introduced the piece to most modern listeners, and it's still the benchmark against which all others are measured. But another excellent option is the 16s recording from 2003, conducted by Harry Christophers. Now, this was recorded in SACD surround sound, so if you have suitable equipment, the spatial element comes through beautifully. But I think perhaps the most interesting recent recording is Iffagiolini's 2010 version on Decca, conducted by Robert Hollingworth. Now, they pair it on the album with Strigio's works, so if you buy the entire disc, you can hear the Italian music that may have prompted Tallis's response. Now, they use also some instruments of the time, cornets, sackbuts, and continuo. And that's based on the scholar Hugh Cates' research suggesting that, in fact, the original performance may have included instrumental support, which is a controversial theory, but fascinating to consider and to listen to this and think what that might have sounded like. And of course, if you're ever in a place where someone is putting on a live performance of Spem and Alium, go and hear it. Absolutely unforgettable, I think. But I'll finish off now with something that strikes me as a composer. Spem and Alium is a monumental work. 40 voices, massive structural complexity, layers of hidden symbolism. But it was composed by a man whose epitaph praised his mild and quiet sort. A man who navigated decades of lethal religious upheaval without visible confrontation. A man whose individual vocal lines are models of unassuming singability. The genius of Spem in Alium is the genius of emergence. 40 relatively simple parts combined to something overwhelming. The complexity arises from the combination, not from the individual elements. Now this, I think, is it. How something complex that becomes something great emerges from such simple ingredients. Now, I once had the chance to sing in a performance of Spem in Alium. This was the idea of Freshers' Week fun at Manchester University in the music department back in the day. And it was unforgettable. The part you're given to sing is in theory quite simple, but all that music emerging from around you, from everyone else singing, makes it really significantly more difficult to follow what you're trying to sing, and you have little sense of what you yourself are contributing to the overall whole. It reminds me a bit of being in a sports stadium, if you've ever been there, when 40,000 people or more start singing the same sort of chant. It's never quite clear how that starts, is it? And that feels like something singular that has emerged from all these people, that is of them, but also somehow not of them. Somehow quite similar to be on the inside of Spem in Alium. Now, Tallis survived by keeping his head down, by writing what was required, by not rocking the boat. But in this one piece, he allowed himself to create something that transcends all the political and religious conflicts that shaped his life. A prayer for humility, delivered in the most magnificent music he could imagine. At least that's how it seems. But perhaps it's a deeply subversive piece, at once subtle enough to avoid outright accusations, but clear enough to those who are listening. A plea from the persecuted, set in a form so overwhelming that it still stops people in their tracks nearly 500 years later. The piece's survival through centuries of neglect, its rediscovery, its 21st century fame, all of this testifies to an achievement so powerful that no historical distance can diminish it. Okay, go now and listen to the Tallis Scholars recording of Spem and Alium, or another recording, or if you get the chance, if you're so lucky, go and hear a live performance. You go and do that, and I'll go and work on the next podcast. Bye for now.